talk. Okay, so Dr. Stefan Kahl is a computer scientist, postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Chemnitz University in Germany, working on AI algorithms for animal sound ID. He's the lead of the BirdNET team, where they develop state-of-the-art tools for anyone interested in large-scale acoustic monitoring. And he's going to be going through AI-powered bioacoustics with BirdNET with us today.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome everyone. What I would like to do today is walk you through a few basics about BirdNET, introduce what it is, what the tools are that we're building, showcase a few applications that we're using our tech and that our tech can be used, and then talk a bit about what the future holds for BirdNET. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or ask them afterwards, and then I will try to do my best to answer all of them. Just as a quick introduction, because sometimes people confuse it, or it's a bit confusing, admittedly. Like, what is BirdNET? What do we understand? Like, why do we call it BirdNET? What is it? Is it a model? Is it an app? Is it a framework, a library? And it's all of these things. And what I like to say is that BirdNET is actually a set of AI tools that was designed for scientists, that can be used to automate the analysis of large amounts of audio, and it does sound ID. We started with Bird ID, but we'll see, I'll introduce why it's not just Bird ID anymore. So like maybe even the name BirdNET in itself is a bit confusing. But again, it's a set of AI tools, and we basically serve two pillars, or have two separate use cases. And the first one I want to introduce and briefly talk about is like conservation technology. Of course, like we're trying to build tools to help people working in conservation, bioacousticians, to go through the data quickly. And that has a very very strict research focus. So and it's a pretty commonly used system. We have like 700 plus citations for our BirdNET paper, which is insane, which I've never expected when I was starting BirdNET as my PhD project. There's more than 80 projects worldwide that use BirdNET, and those are just the ones that we know of. Our software tools on GitHub have more than 25,000 downloads. It is a very popular GitHub repository, which then emphasizes that we have an open source community. So we have more than 1,000 GitHub stores and 190 forks, which is then other projects using our tech. And so I think this is something that's something that I'm really proud of, and that just showcases what open sourcing computer science tools can do. And so if you're interested in accessing some of these tools, I put the link on the slide down there, and the link will probably go in the chat. So we have more than just one repository. We build tools for conservationists and ecologists. So make sure to give them a try and check it out. There's this other pillar, which I would call community science, and that's usually the thing that people know, or at least that people come in contact with first. And that's our apps, or our backyard monitoring tools. And so our app has like mind-boggling 6.7 million total downloads since it was released in 2018. Since our tools are open source, there's other projects that use our tech and then allow people to do backyard monitoring. And so that's more than 5,000 Haiku boxes, Bird with a Box, and BirdNET Pies. And through all of these projects, we got like 2+ billion geotagged sound snippets with Bird ID across all of these community science projects, which is an insane number. And so that's definitely something we're super proud of. But we still want to continue. We're continuing developing these tools, and we're trying to keep them open source. So in case you're wondering, how does it actually work? So like this all sounds great, right? It's commonly used, like it can do Bird ID, but how does it actually work? And so I want to, part of this introduction, I just want to like walk you through like the very basics of what we do with these AI models. And so if you think about processing sound, usually you think of sound as a waveform. So like that's a 1D input, that's a 1D sequence of values, right? And so you can see some patterns in this recording. So that's a waveform of a recording. But then if you transform this recording into a spectrogram, now all of a sudden it becomes an image, right? And this image has patterns, it has notes, it has sequences, it has syllables of bird sound. And since it's image processing, we're now actually doing object recognition in images when we're doing sound processing. And I think this is an important concept to understand, that the things we're doing, like the AI systems we're building, are not processing raw audio, they're processing images. And so now we can rely on the things that have been established in previous years in computer science that do object recognition in images. And so usually how it goes is you still need audio. You use lots and lots of audio, like tons of audio of it. And we usually access those from Macaulay Library, Xeno Canto, sometimes eBird. There's other bigger libraries, there's iNaturalist. So we try to leverage all of these publicly available data collections. We do extract spectrograms for all of these recordings, and then the spectrograms ideally, hopefully, have the calls of the target species, and then we train what we call an artificial neural network. And so you feed millions and millions of these samples through the network. It will brute force, find patterns, memorize those patterns, and then try to map those patterns to a certain species to be able to recognize the calls. And so the question then is like, is that still AI? Is that something that is this nice, shiny, flashy thing that everyone calls AI, or is this just like brute force memorization? And I think we can have a bit of a debate of what is what. But for now, let's just call it AI. Because it's still like a relatively sophisticated pattern recognition algorithm. And so what I always like to show people is, what does it actually look on the inside? And because if you think about AI, sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, it's a black box. Nobody knows what it's doing. And so I thought, well, let's open this black box and let's take a look at what BirdNET looks on the inside. And the first thing I want to mention is that these artificial neural networks that we're training are organized in layers. And so the signal passes through different layers. And what I visualized here in this graphic is the output, the intermediate outputs of some of those layers. And I'm just going to walk you through the steps of processing that happen inside the model. So if we start off with the raw audio, that's a waveform. And then the first thing we do, and I just mentioned this, is convert it into a spectrogram. And so now that's an image, and now everything we do within the model is image processing. And what these models will do, they will apply filters to those images, filters like enhancing edges, separating foreground from background. And that's what the first layer will do. These filters are not something that humans develop. That's something the AI learned by itself. And so in the first layer, you say, yeah, well, you know, the source spectrogram is turned into these different channels. All of them show like a few more different details. It's very primitive features. I can understand that. That's not much a black box. But as we progress through the model and then go from layer to layer to layer and go deeper, the outputs become more abstract. And then eventually we'll end up with something like this. And that's a feature vector. And that's just a bunch of numbers. And so these numbers are abstract and not human interpretable anymore. But that's where all the meat is. That's where the secret sauce is. This is semantically summarizing the input signal. That's the embedding. And that's why people call it a black box, because this is where all the knowledge is, like all of the semantics that was extracted from the patterns the model recognized. And that's being used to recognize the actual birds. And so it's still a black box. Like we can visualize it, but it's still a black box because nobody knows what it is. The important step that then happens is after we've extracted these audio features and embedded them in these vectors, we add another layer to it, and this additional layer has neurons, artificial neurons, and each neuron is associated with a species. And just in the human brain, the activation level of these neurons indicates which species might be vocalizing. And so in that case, if you just look at this tiny little dot at the bottom, that's associated with the song thrush. And then the level of activation roughly correlates with a confidence score, or maybe even some call it probability that this bird is actually vocalizing. And so I think this is an interesting concept. Like we're doing image recognition, we're doing pattern recognition in images. These notes and syllables and phrases of the birds and the animals, these are patterns, and these models can recognize these patterns, even if they've been brute forced, like if we use like brute force training with millions and millions of samples. So the overall recognition workflow in BirdNET is, of course, you need the audio source. So we convert the audio to spectrograms. If it's a longer sequence of audio, we would chop this up into 3-second snippets. So BirdNET only processes a fixed length inputs, and that's 3 seconds. The BirdNET algorithm is an artificial neural network, and that outputs species probabilities, or at least numbers that look like species probabilities. There's still some uncertainty in those predictions. And so what we tend to do in many of our systems is that we apply a filter So we use eBird observations made by community scientists or bird watchers all over the world, to put some sense into these detections, because well, you're in the US and you've just detected a European bird like the robin. That's not going to happen. There's no robins, at least no European robins in the US. And so we can get rid of like this last bit of like uncertainty and then improve detection. So it's twofold. So there's metadata and there's raw audio. We'll combine the two, and that's our recognition workflow. So if we have all that, and you know the apps, you know the community science projects, but there's some actual like conservation focused applications, and I just want to walk you through what I think is our flagship project, because it's one of the largest monitoring efforts that's still ongoing in the US, where we put 1,700 units, Swift1 units, ARUs, autonomous recording units, across the entire Sierra Nevada in California. So that's the 400-kilometer mountain range, that's 20,000 square kilometers area. So it's logistically like a tremendous effort to put all these units out. Each of these units records between 6 p.m. and 9 a.m. So we're mostly targeting nocturnal birds, but we also want to record the dawn chorus. So we get like a good sense of the bird community that are vocalizing in the Sierras. Each of these units is deployed for 5 weeks. So we go out right after the snow is melting, and we bring them back in right before the fire season starts. And that usually results in 0.5 petabyte of data per season. So that's roughly 1 million hours of audio that we're collecting across these 1,700 units. And so this is what it looks like on a map. So we have these locations, and this is an ongoing effort. So we put the recording units on the same tree in the same location every year, to be able to go back and then see the progression over the years. And then we use, of course, BirdNET to process the audio. The model we're using is a custom trained model for the Sierra Nevada. So it features all of the species that we might expect, or like the species we're targeting. And we can roughly process, with the setup that we're using, 1 hour of audio in under a second. And that's really necessary, because if you want to process 1 million hours of audio, we have to be really quick. All right, so the Sierra, and that's probably something that everyone knows, is known for these large fires that are getting more and more severe. And so talking about using acoustics to mitigate some of these effects and having an actual conservation impact, the question is, okay, how do we leverage ARUs? How do we leverage AI? How do we go beyond what human observers could do? And so what we tried to do, or like our methodology, is that we picked a bunch of indicator species. The ones we know that are indicators for certain habitats, like compositions or species compositions, and the species that we know can be recognized by BirdNET relatively reliably. So those are like the two important factors. And so what we want to do is we want to support evidence-based restoration planning. So if there's fires, and then the U.S. Forest Service is thinking about restoring the forest, and we want to inform or help them make better decisions. So we picked a bunch of species: songbirds, woodpeckers, quails, owls, even some raptors. And we looked at their correlation with certain covariates and their correlation with fire. And so the correlation with fire is something we know because we put these units out every year. If an area burned down, we'll still put the recording unit in the same location, and then record the bird community in that location, and then see which birds responded to the fire. Like some of those might respond positively, some of those might not. And so if you look at occupancy, you can of course just correlate occupancy with the sites that actually had the birds. So let's say for the fox sparrow in this scenario, the blue dots are the sites that had a fox sparrow detection. And then if you correlate with the covariates, you can actually predict occupancy across the entire mountain range, which is really neat. So which is something like this resolution is unprecedented. So you can't easily do that, or can't easily replicate that with human observers. And so talking about like fire prevention or like fire management, what we now did is we built this interactive management tool, and it actually combines remotely sensed data, the species detection we have, and their habitat relationships. And then now managers can just manipulate a few sliders and just see what restoring a certain area would do and how that affects occupancy of certain species. And so they can really target their efforts on saying, okay, like, this is a high priority species. We want to target that species. What are the things we need to do? What are the areas that we need to restore? What are the things that we need to do to prevent fires, maybe even, or yeah, to support a certain species? And so this is something I think on this scale, at this resolution, this is unprecedented. I still have to say that the Sierra project is not necessarily something that translates well to other areas of the world, because we do have roads, we do have rangers that can go there by car. So there's like infrastructure. We have people, or like the institutions we collaborate with, they have a lot of compute. We can run stuff in the cloud. We can store amounts of data. So that's not something that easily translate to other PAM projects. And so I would say one of the biggest drawbacks, again, of like passive acoustic monitoring and archival monitoring, is that you just end up with a shitload of data. And that's usually something that you don't want to handle. It's just tough. Like you end up with 1,700 SD cards. You end up with loads and loads of data. Data has to go somewhere, has to be stored. Storage is not cheap. And so the question is, okay, acoustic monitoring, it has some updates. We can pick indicator species. We can observe it over longer periods of time. But we don't want to do archival anymore. So ideally, we would be able to do something like real-time monitoring. Ideally, we would have recording devices that are smart and that can run the algorithm on device. So we don't have to collect the data anymore. And so that's something we're developing in collaboration with a company in Germany, ecoTECH. And we've built these recording units that you can put out. And we actually have a few showcase projects. One of them, and that's where the photo was taken, is in Sapsucker Woods, which is in Ithaca, which is the area around the lab of ornithology. And so we put out these units just to see if they last the entire year. Like, are they actually low maintenance? Do they submit and transmit data? If you're in a forest, well, solar powered units might not be the best thing to do. And so that's just something we're exploring. But essentially the hardware we're using, those are still like development prototypes. You can't necessarily buy them off the shelf, but like we're trying slowly to get there. Of course, there's a solar panel. Of course, there's batteries you want to charge. So nobody has to go out and change the batteries. So you want to leave these units out, not just for 5 weeks, but then for an entire year, even like a multi-year deployment. There's a Raspberry Pi in there. Raspberry Pi is a mini computer that can run BirdNET. So the vanilla BirdNET model is small enough and efficient enough to run on a mini PC that can be solar powered. There's a microphone at the bottom, and there's a SIM dongle, like an USB dongle that has a SIM card. So you want to be able to not just record and analyze, and then stuff still ends up on an SD card. You want to submit the detection. And this is what the submission workload, or like the detection workflow actually looks like. So the bird is vocalizing, or the animal is vocalizing. The units are listening. They're not listening 24/7. So the Raspberry Pi is still too power hungry. So they're on a schedule, and usually we do 10 minutes every hour. Some of the units will record the entire day. Some of the units will only record diurnal birds. So then we run BirdNET. BirdNET again, recording, spectrogram, chop it up, run it through the artificial network, and then get probabilities. If these probabilities for a certain bird cross a certain threshold, we will then upload that to a database. We will submit the audio snippet, like really just the 3-second snippet, and the detection. And so what you end up with is you get a database, an archive that has the detections. You can still go back and validate. You're not blindly trusting the AI or the recording unit. And you can build these fancy websites then off of the database. And so just to give you an example of what one of these websites looks like, so that's something that ecoTECH developed for the units. So that's what I would say professional backend. We do have visitor-facing backends, or like community scientist backend, but this is for biologists. You have obviously a map with the different recording locations. You can see the status of all these units, and then you'll get detections over certain periods of times. And so usually you see like the detection of the last 24 hours. You can walk through them, you can validate, you can see if it's actually a species, you can listen to recording, you can request more recordings. And so over time, you'll build this inventory of your species you're looking for. If you're using a specific species list and you have like a certain target species, you want to make sure to actually go through and validate. So like we're not just blindly trusting AI, but everything runs in real time. Nobody has to go there. You go there once, deploy the unit, and then data's being transmitted automatically. So you don't end up with loads and loads of data, you only end up ideally with the interesting snippets. And so talking about that, and I mentioned this a few times, we can do birds and it's still BirdNet, right? But ideally, we want to do biodiversity monitoring. And so biodiversity is more than just birds, even though birds are common indicators for habitat health or ecosystem health. So how do we do BirdNet for everything? And the one thing we've established over the past years, and you can go to this URL or scan the QR code, we've developed this tool that lets you take BirdNet, the model that we provide online, and then use your own training data to train a custom classifier. So what's a custom classifier? So let's say you're targeting a certain species and it's in BirdNet, but it's not really performing well. Maybe it's a low frequency species, or it's an owl, or yeah, maybe it's easily confused with other animals. But you still have like some nice recordings. You can take those recordings and then really narrow the detector down on this species and improve performance. And you can do this with an open source tool, and then you'll end up with your own model that does the job probably better than the original BirdNet version. Or maybe even you're looking for something that's not even a bird. So maybe it's amphibians you're targeting, and now you can take BirdNet, even though it was trained on birds, but I showed you like that the majority of the model is just audio feature extraction. And then only the last layer that maps species to these audio features, that's where the birds are. So you can throw the birds away and add amphibians to it. And now all of a sudden you leverage a pre-trained BirdNet, you leverage the audio feature extractor that BirdNet is, and then train for your amphibians. And then you can deploy the same model. It'll run on these units. You can use it for larger PEM deployments, and it'll do very specific things for your specific deployment and research questions. So that's something that we've established, and that's something that people are frequently using. And so that was such an eye opener for us. Like, okay, like this is what people want. Like people want to tailor the models to their use case. But it's still a lot of effort because you still have to collect data and polish the data. You still have to go through training a model. Even though you don't have to code, you still need to understand what a nice training data set is, what a test data set is, what a metric is, how you benchmark that. And so ideally, we still want to like include as many species as we can. And so as we're working on next generation models, the thing we really want to do is want to support all platforms and all frameworks, which is important for all kinds of collaborators, because we're not the ones building the applications, we're the ones training the models and building the interfaces, and then someone else has to build the applications. That's what we want to do. So I feel the BirdNet team as providing the service to people to build these frameworks and libraries that run ideally on edge devices, on workstations, in cloud deployments, and all of these things. The next generation of models will actually be a model family, and we'll have like bigger models that are more precise but require more compute, and we'll have smaller models that are less precise but require less compute. And then people can pick the one that suits their use case. So if you're on an edge device and you want to be power efficient and you're relying on a solar panel, you want a smaller model. If you say, hey, I'm on the cloud, I have funding to run stuff in the cloud, I don't care about compute, I want to use the big model because I'm interested in like maximum precision. All of the things we're doing is like everything is open source. The models will be open source. If people have issues running the models, they can reach out to us through the issues tracker on GitHub, and then we will try to solve that. Ideally, the next generation models will not just be birds, and right now it looks like we're going to have like all 10,000 bird species plus 2, maybe 3,000 non-birds. That's mostly amphibians and mammals. Mammals probably excluding bats, because bats are a bit of a challenge because of the frequency range. We will support variable input lengths. So moving away from the 3-second restriction. So if you have a species that has longer vocalizations, thinking about like marine mammals maybe, so like it's a 30-second long calls, or maybe then eventually it is bats and it's just like a second or half a second. We can accommodate that, and we'll try to have more frequent release cycles. So, and that's important. If we have more release cycles, we can like adapt to people's use cases. And that's something we always try to learn is how are people using our models? What are the things we need to implement? What are the things we need to improve? And so with next-gen models also comes next-gen libraries. And I apologize, but this is like the slide that has the most numbers, but I think it's still interesting. What we're trying to do is, since we view ourselves as a service provider and like building interfaces and libraries that people can use in their applications, we try to make them as performant as possible. And so I mentioned this 1,000,000 hours that we have to process every year, and that we can process an hour of audio in under a second, but that's a large cloud deployment, and not everyone has access to that. So what we're trying to do is optimize performance for different compute scenarios. And so what we tried is we tried a CPU workstation with 4 physical cores. That's a bit of an outdated laptop, 7 gigabytes of RAMs. And we did is we ran 1,000 hours of audio, and it took 6 hours. And that's good. That's totally reasonable. I guess like for most smaller to medium-sized deployment, that's a good time. Like if you have to run it for a day, and then you have species detections in all of your audio, that's reasonable. If you have access to a workstation, and the one we had has 48 physical cores, you can process 1,000 hours in 30 minutes. Now, if you not just have access to a workstation, but this workstation actually comes with a GPU, so hardware that is optimized to run neural networks, you can actually process 1,000 hours in 6 minutes. And so now all of a sudden, these larger PAM deployments, like 1,000,000 hours or 100,000 hours, 1,000,000 hours, those become feasible. And that's like the way we want to do it. Like we want to allow people to scale up their operation, not just put a bunch of units out, but then actually put loads and loads of units out. So if you're not doing real time, if you're still doing archival, you still need to be able to process large amounts of data in a relatively short time. And so just to mention some implementation details, even though like that's just like a niche thing to talk about, the frameworks we're developing, I have this in here because you can pick different model types. You can pick if it's like our geo model, if it's the acoustic model. You can pick different model versions. Again, I mentioned there's going to be like a model slew of things. You can pick different backends that you're going to use in your service. You can pick if you want to run it on CPU, on GPU, whatever hardware you have. And you can pick a language, which is then important for the labels you're getting. And so we're trying to accommodate all of these things through the frameworks we're developing. And so one question that we sometimes get is like, if you're building like this large detector and there's people that have like different needs and they realize BirdNET is underperforming for their needs, how can they contribute? And I think like the most valuable contribution, like, and that's like, it's a common thing, that's just something that's like people acknowledge, is data. Like we do need data. Like the AI systems we're using, they work well, they can recognize patterns, but they still need loads and loads of data. And so there's, I would say, 2 ways of contributing data. And the first one is, if you use our tools, you run BirdNET on your data, you get detections, and then you review these detections, and then you save the reviewed detections in a folder. If you share that folder on Google Drive or Box or OneDrive, we can access it, and it's already in the correct format because you've used BirdNET in the first place, so the labels are matching, and we get files and folders, so we get like species association with it. So that's pretty nice. So for us, that's a relatively seamless, we can relatively seamlessly integrate that into our workflow. If you don't have that, if you have data collections that were manually annotated, we would ask you to think about sharing these data on Xenocanto, because we're frequently crawling Xenocanto and updating the library we're training with. And so eventually your recordings will make their way into our training database. And so that's like the 2 ways to contribute. If you have larger collections that have been manually annotated, we usually also tend to collaborate with people and publish data. The one thing to keep in mind is that computer scientists can't develop anything if they don't have access to the data. We're not biologists, we're not doing our own experiments, and so we're relying on other entities and people to contribute data. All right, and so that wraps up my presentation, and I just want to like mention one thing, and I guess that's the most important thing. And I've been talking to people in these webinars and in office hours and on conferences, and sometimes having these AI systems that work well in one place and they don't in the other, like creates a bit of an expectation. And I just want to like mention that I think the role of AI or of BirdNET is not to replace human insight. So we're not here to answer your question. That's still something you have to do. But the thing we want to do, or the thing that we want to achieve with BirdNET, is that we want to save you some time. And so ideally, we can accelerate the path to insight, or accelerate the path to answering your question. Speaking about question, if you have any questions, again, now is the time to do that. Put them in the chat or ask directly. And then thank you so much for joining. If you want to know more, please go to birdnet.cornell.edu. or reach out via email. Thank you so much.